3 weeks after firing Mason Carter, CEO Evelyn Grace watched him kneel inside a burning industrial warehouse, wrists bound tight, a pistol pressed against his skull. This was the same man who had once ripped her from an exploding car and taken shrapnel meant for her chest, yet she had trusted a forged file branding him a traitor. Now her enemies streamed the execution live, demanding she surrender full control of her entire company. When her own security team blocked her from boarding the helicopter, Evelyn broke down and begged them to help her save the man she had destroyed. Stay with this story to the very end to find out whether Evelyn truly reaches Mason before he disappears forever. 6 weeks before that burning warehouse, the story began in a very different place. Evelyn Grace stood at the center of her own rising empire, preparing to unveil Meridian Shield, an automated control platform worth more than $1 billion, designed to run cargo operations across dozens of American ports. The launch had consumed a year of her life, and she meant to walk into that unveiling looking untouchable. On the morning of the announcement, Mason Carter noticed something almost no one else would have caught. 3 parking structure cameras had dropped their feed at the exact same moment, for exactly 17 seconds. Ryan Connor waved it off as a routine software update, but Mason had spent too many years reading the difference between coincidence and preparation to accept that answer. He asked Evelyn to delay her travel schedule and swap vehicles before the drive to the investor summit. Evelyn saw a packed calendar, a room full of waiting investors, and a security officer asking her to rearrange her entire morning over a glitch. She refused. Logan Wyatt made sure the refusal stuck. In front of the executive board, he smiled and called Mason a soldier who hadn't yet adjusted to boardroom life, a man still fighting battles that no longer existed. Evelyn didn't laugh along with him, but she didn't overrule him either. When the motorcade pulled away from headquarters, Mason spotted a service truck that had trailed them through 2 consecutive intersections, always the same distance back, always turning exactly when they turned. He told the driver to leave the planned route immediately. Seconds later, another vehicle forced Evelyn's car against a guardrail. A device bolted beneath the chassis began to glow with a soft, deliberate light that Mason recognized instantly for what it was. He tore the door open, hauled Evelyn out onto the pavement, and threw his own body over hers just as the car erupted behind them. A shard of torn metal caught his shoulder in the same instant, driving deep enough that he would carry the scar for the rest of his life. Even flat on the ground, blood soaking through his shirt, Mason kept his eyes on the road. He watched the suspicious truck pull away, memorizing a partial plate number and the faded emblem stenciled on its door before the pain finally caught up with him. At the hospital, Evelyn came to thank him in person. Mason waved off the gratitude entirely. What mattered to him wasn't the rescue but the fact that whoever planned the attack had known her secret route down to the minute, a detail only a handful of people inside Grace Meridian could have possibly known. Evelyn sat with that thought long after he left the room. This hadn't been an accident, and it hadn't been random. Someone close to her, someone drawing a paycheck from her own company, had helped design the very moment that nearly killed her. Mason made one thing clear before the nurses ushered him toward surgery. The person who wanted Evelyn dead wasn't circling the building from outside. He was already sitting inside it, behind a desk, wearing a company badge. Outside the hospital room, reporters had already begun gathering, drawn by rumors of an explosion involving the CEO of a rising technology firm. Evelyn's public relations team scrambled to control the story before it spiraled into something the investors couldn't ignore, framing the incident as an isolated mechanical failure rather than anything deliberate. Mason paid none of that attention any thought. His mind stayed fixed on the 17 seconds of missing footage, the truck that had trailed them with practiced patience, and the unsettling fact that whoever built that device had known precisely when Evelyn's car would pass beneath that overpass. Coincidence didn't move with that kind of precision. By the time he was wheeled into surgery, Mason had already decided that recovery would be temporary and vigilance would not. He asked a nurse to bring him a notepad so he could write down everything he remembered before the anesthesia dulled the details beyond recovery. Evelyn stood at the window of the waiting area long after the doctor disappeared behind swinging doors, replaying the moment the car had lifted off the ground. She kept coming back to one detail that unsettled her more than the fire itself. Mason hadn't hesitated for even a fraction of a second before throwing himself between her and the blast. Once he was discharged, Evelyn offered Mason paid leave to recover, but he turned it down flat. He believed the most dangerous moment in any operation was the one right after everyone else decided to relax. Mason spent his recovery quietly tracing the service truck. The plate number led to a transport company that had dissolved years earlier, but the emblem on the door matched a former contractor who had once done work for Grace Meridian. Cara Madison discovered that same contractor had been granted access to restricteds just 3 months earlier, approved under a signature belonging to Ryan Connor. Evelyn began spending long hours working directly beside Mason, reviewing protocols and rebuilding the security plan from the ground up. She noticed something that surprised her. He never asked about bonuses, never angled for more authority, never once mentioned his name appearing anywhere in the press. All he wanted was full authority to audit every inch of the security system. A brief phone call revealed that Mason had a young daughter currently staying with his sister while he worked in Seattle. He kept the details deliberately vague, unwilling to let anyone inside the company learn her location or her routine. Evelyn understood then that Mason wasn't only protecting her. He was trying to shield his own family from a war he could feel closing in, one he hadn't chosen and couldn't yet name. During his audit, Mason found an anonymous administrator account that had accessed Evelyn's travel data. The account existed for only a few minutes before wiping every trace of itself from the server logs. Ryan suggested it was probably an internal testing script, nothing more. Mason asked that the server be preserved untouched so a proper investigation could follow, but Ryan quietly reported the request straight to Logan. Logan understood immediately that Mason had gotten far too close to the truth. Killing the man who had just saved his CEO's life would draw far too much attention, so instead Logan chose the slower path. He would turn a hero into a traitor in the eyes of everyone who mattered. That same night, confidential files belonging to Meridian Shield were quietly copied off the main servers. System logs showed Mason's security badge and password had been used to authorize the transfer. By morning, Ryan produced a hidden storage device tucked inside Mason's own locker, timed and placed with the precision of a man who had done this kind of work before. Evelyn walked into the investigation room, expecting a routine briefing. Instead, she found Mason's name attached to every single piece of evidence laid out across the table. In the weeks leading up to that morning, Mason had rebuilt nearly every protocol governing Evelyn's movements. He installed redundant tracking on her vehicles, rotated her drivers without warning, and insisted on random route changes that infuriated the scheduling staff but made her far harder to predict. Logan complained more than once that the new procedures were slowing down operations across the executive floor. Evelyn found herself trusting Mason's judgment in ways she rarely extended to anyone inside the company. When investors pressed her about security costs rising sharply after the attack, she defended the spending without hesitation, telling the board that survival wasn't a line item open for debate. None of that made Mason comfortable. He remained wary of praise, wary of proximity to leadership, and especially wary of anyone who seemed too eager to align themselves with him after the attack made headlines internally. He had learned long before Grace Meridian that people who suddenly wanted to be near you after danger passed were rarely doing it for reasons that served you. Ryan used that same period to quietly widen his reach. He requested elevated clearance under the pretense of assisting Mason's audit, then used that access to lay the groundwork for the very files that would soon be used against the man he claimed to be helping. Mason was brought into a closed conference room to face Evelyn, Logan, Ryan, and a company attorney seated stiffly at the far end of the table. The evidence claimed he had accessed classified designs, copied confidential client records, and communicated directly with a rival firm. A substantial sum of money had also just landed in an account bearing his name. Mason stayed calm and stated plainly that every piece of it had been staged. He pointed out that the exact window when his badge was supposedly used matched precisely the time he was in the medical wing having his shoulder wound redressed. Ryan immediately produced camera footage showing a figure of similar build entering the server room. The face stayed hidden beneath a low cap and an angled lens, conveniently unreadable. Cara suggested holding Mason for a deeper investigation instead of rushing to judgment. Logan pushed back hard, warning that any delay could cost the company contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Evelyn asked Mason directly why the money had appeared in his account. He couldn't explain it in the moment, because the account itself had been closed for years and had only just been reactivated using forged paperwork he hadn't seen until that day. Mason reminded Evelyn that only weeks earlier, someone had tried to kill her. He warned that firing the very person investigating that attack would hand a clean victory to whoever had planned it. Logan then played an audio clip that had been carefully edited. In the recording, a voice resembling Mason's seemed to admit knowledge of the explosion before it happened. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her. Doubt crept in, and for the first time she wondered whether Mason had staged the rescue himself, engineering his way close to her simply to gain deeper access to the company's systems. Mason looked at her without pleading and without anger. He only asked whether she truly believed he would take a bullet for a plan built entirely on deception. Evelyn hesitated, torn between her instincts and the mounting pressure from a board that wanted the matter closed before the launch date slipped any further. In the end, she chose the company. She announced that Mason was terminated effective immediately and barred from every Grace Meridian facility without exception. Mason set his badge down on the table without a word. Before he walked out, he warned Evelyn never to trust any route, any security detail, or any communication device that ran through Ryan Connor. Ryan ordered a search of Mason's apartment before he had even reached the parking garage. Evelyn did nothing to stop it. As Mason left the building, Logan stood at the glass wall above and sent a short message to a number saved only under initials, "Begin Phase 2. The lobby emptied slowly around Mason as he walked toward the exit, employees pretending not to watch while stealing glances at the man who had gone, in the span of a single meeting, from savior to suspect. Nobody stopped him. Nobody offered a word of doubt about the verdict that had just been handed down. Kara lingered behind after the room cleared, staring at the printed transcript of the audio recording until the words blurred together. Something about the rhythm of the sentences felt wrong to her, though she couldn't yet articulate exactly why. She slipped a copy of the file onto a private drive before anyone thought to lock her out of the system. Evelyn returned to her office and sat alone for a long while, staring at the empty chair Mason had occupied only an hour earlier. She told herself the decision had been necessary, that a company facing hundreds of millions of dollars in exposure couldn't afford sentiment. The words felt hollow even as she rehearsed them. Logan, meanwhile, moved through the executive floor with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. He made a point of thanking Ryan publicly for his diligence, ensuring the story of Mason's betrayal calcified into company legend before anyone had the chance to question it further. In the days after Mason's dismissal, Grace Meridian worked hard to control the narrative. News of the data theft stayed buried, but whispers began moving through the hallways regardless. Evelyn told herself repeatedly that she had made the necessary decision. Still, she couldn't shake the look on Mason's face the moment he walked out of that room. Kara quietly revisited the evidence on her own time. She found that the audio clip used against Mason contained repeating patches of static, a telltale sign that the recording had been stitched together from several unrelated sources. Meanwhile, Mason left his apartment the instant he sensed he was being watched. He arranged for his daughter to remain with his sister indefinitely and made clear he would not return to Seattle until he could confirm it was safe to do so. Her presence in the story stayed limited to a single short phone call, in which Mason hid his fear entirely and told her only that he was working through something difficult. Mason sought out a former security specialist named Samuel Luke, a man who had once audited the network architecture at Grace Meridian. Samuel revealed that before his termination, Mason had unknowingly downloaded an unaltered system log during a routine check. That log showed clearly that Ryan's account had generated the fabricated access credentials used to frame Mason from the very beginning. Mason wanted to hand the evidence straight to federal investigators, but Samuel warned him that Logan's network reached into multiple agencies and could intercept any conventional line of communication. Back at Grace Meridian, the Meridian Shield platform suddenly triggered an unauthorized sequence of commands. 3 test ports lost operational control for a full 40 seconds before engineers regained authority over the system. Logan blamed the malfunction on malicious code he claimed Mason had planted before his termination. He pressed the board hard for emergency operating authority, framing himself as the only steady hand left in the room. Kara brought her audio analysis directly to Evelyn. For the first time since the firing, Evelyn allowed herself to consider that Mason might have been telling the truth all along. She drove to his apartment only to find it ransacked, bullet marks scarring the wall, dried blood pooled near the doorway, and clear signs that a struggle had taken place there. Panicked, Evelyn called Ryan immediately. He answered calmly, insisting that his security team had no idea where Mason currently was. After hanging up, Evelyn noticed a small hidden camera tucked inside a smoke detector across the room. It occurred to her, with a chill she couldn't shake, that whoever had been tracking Mason might belong to her own security division. That evening, an anonymous message reached her personal line. "If you want to know whether the man who saved you is still breathing, come alone." In the hours before that message arrived, Evelyn had tried repeatedly to reach Mason through every number she had for him, each call ending in silence or a disconnected tone. She paced her office long after the rest of the floor emptied out, unable to shake the feeling that she had set something terrible into motion the moment she signed his termination papers. Samuel Luke, watching Mason work through the unaltered system logs late into the night, warned him that Ryan's fingerprints were all over the fabricated credentials, but the deeper problem was structural. Someone with executive-level clearance had approved Ryan's access in the first place, someone whose signature carried enough weight that no one downstream would think to question it. Mason suspected Logan long before he had proof, not because of any single piece of evidence but because of the man's practiced calm. People who panicked made mistakes. Logan never appeared to make any, which unsettled Mason more than outright hostility ever could have. Kara, working quietly from her own apartment, cross-referenced the timestamps on the falsified recording against Mason's actual medical records from the night of the explosion. The gap between the two was small, easy to miss unless someone was looking for it specifically, but it was there, and it was damning for anyone paying close enough attention. Evelyn didn't tell Ryan about the message. She shared it only with Kara and asked her to keep it strictly between them. The coordinates led to an abandoned ship repair yard. Evelyn arrived alone after dark and found a disposable phone waiting in the middle of an empty room. A distorted voice announced that Mason had taken something that never belonged to him. It demanded Evelyn sign over full control of Meridian Shield to Logan in exchange for his life. Evelyn feigned confusion, but the flicker in her expression gave away that suspicion toward Logan had already taken root inside her. Armed men stepped out from the shadows around her. Evelyn realized too late that she had been lured there to stage the scene of her own disappearance. Mason intervened from a steel walkway above before anyone could act. Even while being hunted, he had kept tracking Evelyn, certain that whoever wanted her gone would eventually use her as bait. He cut the power, triggered an old warning siren, and guided Evelyn through a maintenance tunnel toward the far side of the yard. During the chase, a bullet grazed his side, but he refused to slow down. Hidden together inside a dark engine housing, Evelyn tried to apologize. Mason told her plainly that this wasn't the moment for her to go looking for forgiveness. What mattered now was getting her out alive. Evelyn admitted the recording used against him had been fabricated. Mason showed her the unaltered system log proving Ryan had created the fake account from the start. He explained that Logan's ambitions went far beyond simply seizing the company. Meridian Shield could be weaponized to cripple entire ports, lock down fuel systems, and trigger industrial accidents across a wide stretch of the country. Mason had planned to hand this evidence to federal authorities, but every route he tried had been quietly cut off by people working for Logan. Evelyn offered to go with him. Mason refused, unwilling to trust her yet, reminding her that she was the one who had handed full system access to the very people now hunting him. Before they could slip out of the repair yard, Ryan arrived with an armed team close behind him. Mason shoved Evelyn toward the emergency exit and stayed behind to block the pursuit alone. He held the line until he ran out of ammunition and was finally surrounded. Evelyn heard gunfire echoing behind her but couldn't force herself to turn back. Ryan took Mason alive and told him flatly that Logan wanted him conscious and sharp for the interrogation ahead. The repair yard had once serviced fishing vessels before the business folded, leaving behind rusted hulls and cracked concrete that swallowed sound in strange, uneven ways. Evelyn hadn't noticed any of that on the drive in, focused entirely on the possibility that Mason might already be dead by the time she arrived. When his voice first cut through the darkness above her, something in her chest loosened in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent 3 weeks convincing herself she no longer owed him anything, and yet the relief of hearing him alive nearly buckled her knees. Mason moved through the yard with the same economy of motion she remembered from the day of the explosion, no wasted steps, no hesitation, every decision made a half-second before it was needed rather than after. Watching him work, Evelyn understood for the first time just how badly she had misjudged him weeks earlier. As gunfire closed in around them, Mason kept positioning his body between Evelyn and every possible line of fire, an instinct that seemed to override even his own survival. It was the same instinct that had thrown him in front of a car bomb, and Evelyn realized it had never once been about the paycheck or the title. Evelyn escaped the repair yard and went straight to Kara. She wanted the authorities called immediately, but Kara discovered that every piece of evidence they had just gathered had already been wiped remotely. By the time Evelyn returned to headquarters, Logan had already summoned an emergency board meeting. He announced that Evelyn had suffered a psychological collapse following the attack on her life and was no longer fit to run the company. Ryan testified that Evelyn had secretly met with Mason, a man under active investigation for industrial betrayal. Logan used that single fact to push hard for her immediate suspension as chief executive. Evelyn tried to expose Ryan on the spot, but every access log had been altered beyond recognition. The footage from the repair yard showed only Evelyn standing beside Mason, which made Logan's version of events land with the board. The board voted to temporarily transfer operating authority to Logan. Evelyn had her security badge confiscated and was escorted out of the very building that carried her family's name. The moment mirrored almost exactly the instant she had once ordered Mason out of that same lobby. Kara discovered that Mason had secretly routed a portion of stolen data into her personal legal system just before his capture. The file was locked behind a security question tied to the day of the car explosion. Evelyn remembered something Mason had said to her at the hospital, and the memory was enough to unlock the file. Inside were records of covert transactions linking Logan, Ryan, and a shadow network of foreign business interests. There was also a detailed plan to activate Meridian Shield during a national demonstration scheduled just 3 days away. If Logan succeeded, he could trigger a nationwide crisis and then sell the only working recovery key to whichever buyer offered the highest price. A live signal suddenly appeared on Evelyn's laptop. Mason was bound inside an industrial warehouse. Ryan demanded she surrender the final encryption key still held only by the Grace family line. He declared that Mason would die the moment the countdown on screen reached 0. Kara wanted to contact federal agents right away, but Evelyn understood they didn't have the time, and worse, they had no way of knowing who inside those agencies had already been compromised. Evelyn decided to use the company's experimental helicopter to trace the background signal buried inside the video feed and locate Mason before the countdown ran out. The remaining loyal members of her security detail physically blocked her path to the aircraft, forcing Evelyn to beg the very people she used to command for help in saving the man she had once cast aside. Standing outside company headquarters, no longer carrying any real authority, Evelyn felt the full weight of what she had lost in a single afternoon. The title meant nothing without the trust of the people standing around her, and at that moment, none of them owed her anything at all. Kara stood a few steps back, watching Evelyn plead with men who had followed her without question only days earlier. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in that parking structure, how quickly power could evaporate once the people beneath it decided it hadn't been earned. One of the younger officers finally stepped forward, admitting quietly that he had never believed the charges against Mason in the first place. He had simply lacked the rank to say so out loud when it mattered. His willingness to break ranks now cracked the hesitation of everyone else standing nearby. It took Evelyn nearly 10 minutes of raw, unguarded honesty before the team finally agreed to help her reach the coordinates hidden in that video feed, coordinates that might already lead to a dead man rather than a rescue. This is the moment the story opened on, now seen in full. Evelyn admitted in front of her own security team that she had made a terrible mistake. She wasn't giving them an order anymore. She was pleading with them to help save Mason. A former security officer named Jackson Levi, who had once worked directly beside Mason, agreed to help without hesitation. He told the group that Mason had repeatedly shielded junior staff from dangerous decisions made higher up the chain, decisions Ryan had pushed through without regard for the people beneath him. The analysis team studying the video feed picked out a ship horn, the rhythmic thud of hydraulic pressing equipment, and a distinct alarm cycle that matched a metal recycling facility near the Everett waterfront. Kara warned that the signal could easily be a decoy meant to waste their time. Evelyn noticed something else entirely. Mason was tapping his foot against the floor in a deliberate rhythm, a pattern only someone trained beside him would recognize. His message wasn't only revealing coordinates. It was warning them that 2 separate ambush teams were waiting nearby, positioned to strike anyone who came looking for him. Evelyn understood, watching that tapping foot, that even bound and interrogated, Mason was still working to protect her. They split into 2 teams. Jackson would lead a rescue group approaching from the north, while Evelyn and Kara would move through a drainage tunnel from the south side of the facility. Kara argued strongly against Evelyn joining the approach directly, but Evelyn insisted that Logan would only show his face if he believed she personally carried the encryption key with her. She made herself the bait. Inside the warehouse, Ryan pressed Mason for the location of the backup data. Mason stalled by convincing Ryan that the files would publish themselves automatically the moment he died. Ryan didn't know that was only half true. Mason really had built a release mechanism, but the device meant to trigger it sat inside a watch that had already been confiscated from his wrist. Logan arrived at the warehouse and revealed something Mason hadn't expected. The original car explosion was never meant to kill Evelyn at all. It was designed only to frighten her badly enough that she would hand even more authority to the security division. Mason's unplanned appearance during that attack had ruined the entire plan, forcing Logan to turn her rescuer into a convenient traitor instead. Evelyn heard every word of that confession through a hidden communication device tucked beneath her collar. When she finally stepped out of the shadows carrying the encryption key, Logan smiled and ordered his men to drag Mason forward to face her directly. The recycling facility stretched across nearly an acre of stacked scrap metal and dormant machinery, its towers casting long shadows under a sky heavy with rain that hadn't yet fallen. Evelyn moved through the drainage tunnel with Kara close behind, both women listening for any sound that didn't belong. Jackson's team approached from the opposite side with quiet precision, communicating through short bursts of radio silence rather than words, a rhythm Mason had apparently drilled into every officer who had ever worked directly under him. Evelyn found herself grateful, in that moment, for every protocol she had once dismissed as excessive. Inside the warehouse, Mason kept his voice steady despite the pain radiating from his side, focusing entirely on buying time rather than fighting his restraints outright. He had learned long ago that patience under pressure saved more lives than bravado ever could. Logan's arrival changed the tone of the room instantly. Ryan, who had carried himself with casual confidence throughout the interrogation, straightened noticeably the moment his employer stepped through the door, the dynamic between the two men finally visible for what it truly was. Logan gave Evelyn a window of exactly 3 minutes. If she refused to hand over the key, Ryan would shoot Mason on the spot. If she handed it over, Meridian's shield would fall entirely into their hands. Evelyn stepped forward, prepared to trade the key for Mason's life without hesitation. Mason stopped her immediately. He said his own life could never be worth trading for the lives of the thousands of workers stationed across every port and processing plant the system controlled. Evelyn realized in that instant that Mason still placed strangers above himself, even after she had already stripped away his career and his good name. She pretended to agree, but the key she handed over was only a decoy copy. The moment Logan plugged it into his portable server, it began quietly uploading every file of criminal evidence straight to Kara's backup system. Ryan noticed the strange signal and opened fire without warning. Mason used the chaos to his advantage, driving his shoulder into the nearest guard despite his hands still being bound. Evelyn ducked behind a hydraulic press while Jackson's rescue team stormed in from the north side of the building. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse. Logan triggered an incineration protocol meant to destroy the evidence and sealed every emergency exit at the same time. Smoke spread fast. Mason worked his wrists free of the restraints, only to be pinned down when a steel support beam crashed across his path. Evelyn had a clear chance to escape with Kara, but she turned back to find Mason instead, the exact opposite of the choice she had made weeks earlier when she trusted a company over a man. Ryan ambushed Evelyn along the way. He confessed openly that he had altered the camera footage himself, spliced Mason's voice from old meeting recordings to fake the incriminating audio, and wired the money directly into Mason's long-dormant account. Just before Ryan could pull the trigger, Mason appeared and knocked the weapon out of his hand. The two men fought through fire and moving conveyor belts. Mason took several hard hits but eventually managed to pin Ryan down for good. Evelyn found the small device on Mason's wrist and triggered the mechanism, sending every file of evidence out into the open. Logan fled in an armored vehicle, taking the server carrying the activation commands for Meridian's shield with him. Mason wanted to chase him immediately, but the warehouse roof had already begun collapsing above their heads. Evelyn was pinned beneath a fallen steel beam. Once again, Mason turned back for her. Smoke thickened by the second, curling along the ceiling in heavy black ribbons that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Somewhere beyond the haze, Jackson's team was still exchanging fire with Logan's remaining guards, the sound of it muffled and distant compared to the roar of the flames now climbing the far wall. Mason worked at the beam with what strength he had left, his shoulder screaming from the earlier wound and the fresh graze along his side. Evelyn tried to push herself free at the same time, refusing to simply lie there and wait to be saved. When the beam finally shifted enough for her to slide loose, Mason pulled her upright and half-carried her toward the nearest exit, both of them coughing against the smoke filling their lungs. Behind them, A section of the roof gave way entirely, sending a shower of sparks cascading down where they had been standing only seconds earlier. Outside, in the cold night air, Evelyn collapsed onto the pavement, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion she had been holding back since the warehouse door first opened. Mason knelt beside her, checking her injuries with the same clinical focus he brought to every crisis, even as his own blood soaked steadily through his shirt. Kara received the data pulled from Mason's watch and immediately routed it to federal agents, major news outlets, and every remaining member of the board at once. Logan's true identity was exposed within minutes, but he still had the portable server and the emergency access codes needed to finish what he started. The systems at the Everett port began failing rapidly. Automated cranes swung without warning, fuel gates locked down entirely, and cargo vessels lost their navigation signals one after another. Mason explained that Logan needed to reach a broadcast relay station on an industrial island to complete the nationwide activation sequence. Evelyn wanted to go with him. Mason told her she was already injured and owed no one further proof of her resolve. Evelyn answered that she wasn't coming along to prove anything to him. She was coming because Grace Meridian had built this system, and she was the one responsible for stopping it from causing harm. Mason accepted on the condition that she follow every tactical instruction without argument. They took a helicopter after Logan's convoy, but poor weather made landing impossible near the relay station. Mason and Evelyn were forced to approach by a small service boat instead. Logan had explosives rigged along the connecting bridge. Mason spotted the detonation wires just in time and managed to cut 2 of the 3 circuits before they reached the structure. The final circuit still fired, collapsing part of the bridge. Mason shoved Evelyn clear but fell through the broken structure into the framework below. Evelyn could have pressed forward alone to stop Logan, but she refused to leave Mason behind. Using a length of rescue line, she hauled him back up despite the injury to her own arm. That single moment marked how far their roles had shifted. The woman who had once doubted him completely was now risking everything to bring him back. Inside the control room, Logan began a 6-minute countdown, confident that Evelyn lacked the technical team needed to shut the system down without him. Mason realized Logan's malicious code was hidden inside the emergency recovery protocol itself. Stopping it meant cutting power manually at 3 separate points scattered across the facility. Mason headed down toward the machine level while Evelyn moved to confront Logan directly inside the control room. Logan sealed Mason inside a flooding electrical chamber and forced Evelyn to choose between saving him and stopping the attack in time. The relay station sat at the edge of the industrial island, connected to the mainland by a single narrow bridge that groaned under the weight of the wind coming off the water. Evelyn had never set foot on the island before, though she had signed off on its construction budget years earlier without a second thought. The boat ride across had been rough, Mason keeping one hand steady on the wheel while scanning the shoreline for any sign of Logan's men. Neither of them spoke much during the crossing, both aware that whatever came next would decide far more than just their own survival. Once inside the facility, the layout matched almost exactly the blueprints Mason had memorized during his security audits months earlier, though sections of it had clearly been modified without the board's knowledge. Logan had been preparing this location for far longer than anyone at Grace Meridian had realized. Evelyn moved through the corridors with a steadiness that surprised even her, drawing on instincts she hadn't known she possessed until the last several days forced them to the surface. She was no longer the executive who once relied entirely on other people to manage danger for her. Logan expected Evelyn to choose Mason and let the countdown run out entirely. He mocked her for becoming, in his words, too soft to lead. Evelyn understood this was never really a choice between Mason and thousands of strangers. Logan was pushing her toward the same kind of absolute thinking that had led her to fire Mason in the first place. She used the internal communication line to guide Mason toward a manual drainage valve, while stalling Logan with a false offer to negotiate. Injured and nearly out of strength, Mason found a secondary control panel and cut power at the first point. Evelyn distracted Logan further by triggering a fire alarm, forcing the security doors open for a brief 8-second window. Mason escaped the flooding chamber and cut the second point moments later. The final point sat just behind the control room itself. Logan raised his weapon and blocked Evelyn from getting anywhere near it. He confessed that he had served the Grace family for 20 years, always treated as the man standing quietly in the background. Meridian's shield represented his one chance to hold more power than any chief executive ever had. Evelyn told him his real problem was never being underestimated, It was believing that power gave him the right to decide who lived and who didn't. Logan pulled the trigger, but Mason lunged through a side door just in time, throwing off his aim at the last possible second. In the struggle that followed, Logan fell onto the lower service grating and became trapped between two support beams. Mason had every opportunity to leave him there, but he pulled Logan free anyway, choosing to let the law handle him instead. Evelyn cut the final power point with 2 seconds left on the countdown. The port systems reverted to manual control. The attack was stopped before it could spread any further. Federal agents arrived to take Logan, Ryan, and the remaining members of their network into custody. As paramedics lifted Mason onto a stretcher, Evelyn tried once more to apologize. Mason told her simply that an apology only meant something once it was proven by what she chose to do afterward. Evelyn understood then that pulling Mason out of that warehouse wasn't enough on its own. She still owed him the dignity and the life she had taken from him in the first place. The relay station fell quiet in the aftermath, the countdown clock frozen at 2 seconds, its glow the only steady light left in a control room otherwise scorched by gunfire. Federal agents moved through the facility methodically, cataloging evidence that would take months to fully process in court. Ryan said almost nothing as he was led away in restraints, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who understood exactly how much time he would spend paying for what he had done. Logan, by contrast, remained defiant even in custody, insisting until the very end that he had only ever tried to protect the company from its own CEO's inexperience. Kara arrived at the island shortly after the agents secured the perimeter, carrying with her the full data trail that would ultimately support every charge filed against both men. She found Evelyn sitting quietly beside the stretcher carrying Mason, neither of them speaking, both simply grateful the countdown clock had stopped in time. News of the failed attack spread quickly through the following morning, though the full scope of what had nearly happened wouldn't become public knowledge until federal prosecutors were ready to release it. 3 weeks later, the federal investigation confirmed Mason's complete innocence. Logan and Ryan faced charges covering conspiracy, kidnapping, sabotage of critical infrastructure, and corporate espionage on a scale few had ever seen. Evelyn held a public press conference. She refused to shift blame onto the board or onto the forged evidence that had once convinced her. Instead, she admitted plainly that she herself had fired the man who saved her life, without giving him any fair chance at an honest investigation. She announced a temporary step back from her role so Grace Meridian could undergo an independent overhaul. Evelyn restored Mason's full standing, back pay, and every benefit he had lost. She offered him the newly created position of Chief Safety Officer, reporting directly to the board rather than to her. Mason turned down that first offer. He had no interest in returning to a system that only changed shape once it was forced into a corner. Evelyn didn't push him. Over the following months, she rebuilt the company from the inside, removing everyone tied to the conspiracy, establishing real protections for whistleblowers, and handing safety oversight to a fully independent unit. Mason watched those changes unfold from a careful distance. Slowly, he noticed that Evelyn had stopped trying to win his trust back with words alone. After 6 months, Mason agreed to return as an independent safety consultant, not as an employee under Evelyn's direct authority. His daughter appeared only in a single brief line when Mason mentioned that this new arrangement finally let him spend far more time with his family than his old job ever had. In the closing scene, Evelyn and Mason stood together on the rooftop of headquarters after the very first independent safety review had wrapped. Evelyn asked quietly whether he had forgiven her yet. Mason told her he hadn't forgotten what happened, but he had started to believe that she had genuinely changed. Evelyn didn't ask for anything more than that. She simply stood beside him as the city lights came on below them. The story closes on two people once torn apart by suspicion, choosing instead to rebuild trust one careful step at a time, not out of obligation or the weight of a life once saved, but because both of them had finally learned the true cost of honesty, responsibility, and a second chance earned rather than given.